So in light of all those things, it can be troublesome, like, oh my gosh, how am I going to, if all those things impact me, it can be really troublesome how we're going to handle those changes and requirements to stay on top of our billing so that we don't miss out on reimbursements. The good news is there are solutions. So Medisoft, and I got to kind of be a part of that conversation with them, looking at what the challenges were to identify what would be the best way to handle it. And what we kind of saw that it would be really important for us to identify at the insurance carrier level whether or not that carrier required ICD-9 or ICD-10, and if they did require ICD-10, when the effective date would be, so that even in advance we could tell the system when that carrier was going to implement ICD-10, and we based it off of the date of service, the effective date. In doing that, it kind of eliminated some of the problems, because if we can identify at the insurance level when the effective date is, then it wouldn't really matter when the claim was billed out, because we could tell, the system could tell the claim whether to pull on the ICD-9 code or the ICD-10 code. That also overcame the other challenge where if we have a case where we have a primary and a secondary that need different versions of the ICD-10, or sorry, the ICD codes, then again the program could automatically correct that without us having to do a bunch of manual process to make those changes. So what is that going to look like in Medisoft? The first change that you're going to see is at the insurance level. When you're editing the insurance or creating new insurance, you can now, on the Options and Codes tab, specify which ICD code version that insurance requires. And if even today you can go ahead and set it as ICD-10 and then enter in the effective date, because that effective date is based off of date of service. So anything billed prior to that date will automatically pull ICD-9 if the effective date for ICD-10 isn't until the future. The good news is a lot of you have extensive lists of insurance carriers. So instead of making it a tedious process for you to edit every single one of them, we've built into Medisoft an set ICD version utility. So on kind of a batch level, you can look at all of your insurance carriers and select them all. And if your practice is lucky enough to just be straightforward that all of your carriers are going to ICD-10 October 1st, 2015, and a few clicks, you can set all of them to do that. And then little tip, there's an option to sort by type. So if you do click on the type there, the type column, you can quickly group all of your work comp, for example, together, so you could just uncheck those few carriers and update everybody else. And I am going to demo that in just a little bit. So the other thing that happened in Medisoft is, in order for this to work, in order for the insurance to be able to pull the right version of the ICD code, we had to create a type of mapping. So in the code setup now, you'll see the first item is just code and description, and that truly is what you see when you're in transaction entry, entering in your charges. So that can really be anything you want it to be. If you prefer to see the ICD-9 codes when you're entering charges, if you prefer to see the ICD-10 codes, you can set it however you want. My recommendation would be to go ahead and rip off the Band-Aid and start learning ICD-10 and setting up your new codes with ICD-10. And then you can see there are fields now for the mapping for this would be the ICD-9 code and the ICD-10 code. So based on what's filled out in the mapping section of it is what will get pulled onto your claim. The code up here will never be pulled onto your claim. That's just for you to identify it when you're entering in your transactions. There's also new search capability when you're looking in your diagnosis list. So you can search by any of these fields, like the code, the descriptions, the specific versions. There's also the visual filters where if you only want to see your codes that have ICD-10s set up in them, you can turn that on and view just those codes or vice versa. There's also new warning messages. So if you do happen to have a mix of codes in your diagnosis list, some of the old codes that weren't updated, some of the new codes that you've entered, if you use a code that does not have the mapping properly filled out for the version that that insurance needs based off of the date of service, again, the effective date, then the system will now warn you when you're entering in that code. It will highlight that diagnosis code in red and transaction entry and also if you're using the EHR unprocessed transactions or mobile, it will highlight in red any diagnosis that's not properly mapped for the insurance that patient has. Sorry, there you go. And then when you're saving your transactions, it is going to throw a warning up to let you know or identify that the code is missing the proper mapping so that you can either edit it or switch the code if you need to before you save the transaction. If you do ignore all those codes, there's one more fail-safe. When you're in claim management and you create a claim that has a diagnosis code that's not properly mapped for that insurance, then there is a new status for diagnosis error. So it will actually stop your claim. It won't be set automatic. It will not set it to ready to send if there is a diagnosis error. And when you look at that, if you were to edit that claim, you can see there's that new status. And on the transaction tab, it would highlight in red whichever code was the code that had a problem. So the good news is, based off of all those new setup options, you do not have to wait until October 1st, 2015 to start learning the new codes and implementing them into your workflow. The other good news is we have taken advantage of the GEM. So there's another tool available in the new version called your ICD-10 mapping tool. The GEMs, if you're not familiar with them, GEM stands for General Equivalency Mapping. They were developed by the National Center for Health Statistics and CMS. They were developed to meet the needs to have some type of crosswalk between ICD-9 and ICD-10 codes. So there's a way to compare data before and after that October 1st deadline. They are not a one-to-one crosswalk, so they're not going to be it's not necessarily just as simple as finding a perfect match in ICD-10. That's not always the case. But they are referenced, and they can help you determine the correct ICD-10 or at least the ICD-10 codes that you could choose from in general in most scenarios. They can be downloaded for free at cms.gov. If you are trying to work on your processes and everything in your practice, they do have CMS does have the GEMs up there by practice specialty, so that's something that you could look for as a resource. And the great news is that they're built into Medisoft to assist you with the ICD-9 to ICD-10 conversion. So there is, again, a new tool called the ICD-10 mapping tool in the latest versions, 19 and 20. So what this tool will do is it will look at all the codes that you currently have in your system that are ICD-9 codes, and if there is a one-to-one mapping for that code, it's going to suggest that for you, and you get to review and select it before it pulls it in. They also provide what we call other mapping. So in some scenarios, we might have one ICD-9 code that could translate into 2 or 10 or even 100 or more ICD-10 codes, and you can see in this particular example, there's one code that translates into many, and you can get to review and select and can pull those codes into Medisoft for you. So while it might not be the solution for every code that you need, because if you remember back to our last webinar where we talked about some of the new features under ICD-10, like combination codes where 2 ICD-9 codes may now be one ICD-10 code because they have both the manifestations and the associated symptoms combined into one. So we might not catch everything that you need, but I would call it a really, really good start. So I'm grateful that got built into these versions for our users. And then again, the last thing is I'm going to actually talk about that in just a second. We're going to talk about now, I'm going to give you a little quick demo of our ICD-10 features. So we're actually going to jump into the program so that you don't have to just see the screenshots, but you can see what we have available and how to set those up in versions 19 and 20. So